Close your eyes for a second. It's 1838, and you're standing on the corner of George and Barrack Streets in Sydney. The air is thick with dust and the smell of horse manure. The colony is barely 50 years old, a rough and tumble outpost of the British Empire, teeming with convicts, soldiers, and settlers trying to scratch a living from the earth. But on this particular corner, a Welsh immigrant is opening a door to a different world. He's selling buckram, ticking, and the finest silks imported from London. He's making a very specific bet that even in a penal colony, people are desperate to feel civilized. His name is David Jones, and for nearly 2 centuries, this name will define who has money, who has class, and who belongs to the establishment. But if you fast forward to 2026, that name is attached to a company in freefall. A business that was once worth over $2 billion has been sold for less than the price of a single office tower. This is the story of how Australia's cathedral of commerce was looted by foreign owners, gutted by bad strategy, and left to rot in the discount bin. This is the collapse of David Jones. David Jones was a Welsh draper who landed in Hobart in 1835 before making his way to Sydney. He looked at the raw, dusty streets of early Sydney and saw a market for luxury. When he opened his first store in 1838, his mission statement was simple: to sell the best and most exclusive goods. He was catering to the aspiring gentry, selling the illusion of London to people stranded at the bottom of the world. The business survived the depression of the 1840s, gold rushes, and wars because it stuck to that single promise: quality. While other merchants engaged in price wars, David Jones maintained a dignified silence and a high price tag. By the time his grandson, Charles Lloyd Jones, took the reins in the 20th century, the company was an institution. But Charles had a vision that went beyond fabric and haberdashery. In the roaring 20s, he set out to give Sydney a landmark that could stand alongside the great department stores of Paris and New York. He looked at a plot of land on Elizabeth Street overlooking Hyde Park and decided to build a palace. When Charles Lloyd Jones announced plans for the Elizabeth Street store, the business community thought he'd lost his mind. In the 1920s, the retail heart of Sydney was down near King Street. Hyde Park was considered too far uptown, a desolate stretch where no shopper would bother to walk. Charles ignored them. His building opened in 1927 and it was a marvel. It was a multi-story building featuring marble staircases, beauty salons, a restaurant, and later an art gallery. The store shifted the entire gravity of Sydney. It became the grand dame of Australian retail. You went there to see art in the gallery, to attend tea dances, and to be seen. This era reached its absolute zenith in February 1954. Queen Elizabeth had just landed in Australia, the first reigning monarch to ever set foot on the continent. The country was in a state of royal hysteria. When Her Majesty needed to attend a state banquet in Sydney, she didn't go to the town hall or Parliament House, she went to the restaurant on the 7th floor of David Jones. For the next 50 years, this was the standard set by the brand. If it was good enough for the Queen, it was good enough for you. For the second half of the 20th century, David Jones operated as a monopoly on prestige. In the Australian retail duopoly, Myer was where you bought school shoes and toaster ovens, while David Jones was where you bought your wedding dress and your perfume. For decades, the stock image of a David Jones customer in Sydney or Melbourne was the well-off North Shore or Toorak matriarch. For women like that, a visit to DJ's was as much a standing social appointment as it was a shopping trip. The David Jones charge card in the purse was part credit line, part quiet status symbol, and many of them talked about "our David Jones" with the kind of possessive pride you usually reserve for a favorite club or restaurant. And the executives believed this loyalty was permanent. They sat on their valuable real estate, counting their profits, assuming that because they were David Jones, they were untouchable. They didn't see the storm gathering on the horizon. If you look at the David Jones share price history, you can pinpoint the exact moment the momentum shifted. It happened in June 2010. At the time, David Jones was led by Mark McInnes, a rock star in the insular world of Australian business. Since taking the CEO role in 2002, he had overseen a golden run of profitability, modernized marketing with Miranda Kerr as the face of the brand, and slashed costs to boost dividends. The board viewed him as indispensable. Then, a junior publicist named Christy Fraser Kirk launched a sexual harassment lawsuit against McInnes and David Jones. The explosive allegations detailed unwanted advances and a boys' club culture at the top of the organization. Front page news for weeks shattered the genteel image of David Jones. McInnes resigned in disgrace, and the company eventually settled with Fraser Kirk for a reported $850,000. The paralysis following this scandal cost the company far more than the settlement check. The board, traumatized by the media firestorm, retreated into a shell of risk aversion. Their priorities shifted from growth to governance, and they appointed Paul Zara, a capable retailer from within the ranks, as the new CEO. However, Zara was fighting with one hand tied behind his back as the distracted board let the strategic momentum evaporate. This paralysis occurred at the worst possible moment. In the early 2010s, Zara, Topshop, H&M, and Uniqlo all entered the market while online shopping expanded to fashion. The exclusivity David Jones relied on was suddenly under attack. You could buy a blazer at Zara for a third of the price, or purchase a luxury handbag online directly from the designer. David Jones needed a wartime leader to reimagine the department store for the digital age, spend money, and take risks. Instead, they drifted, cutting costs and tweaking marketing without fundamentally changing the model. As the share price slid and sales stalled, the market began to view David Jones as prey. In late 2013, historic rival Maya approached David Jones with a radical proposal: a merger of equals. Maya was facing the same headwinds of international competition and rising rents. The Maya board argued that a market of 24 million people didn't need two separate department store chains with massive overheads. A merger would create a single dominant player, saving millions in synergies and providing the scale to fight off global competitors. The David Jones board rejected the offer. The directors felt the deal didn't represent sufficient value to its shareholders. Though, by rejecting Maya, they effectively admitted they needed a solution. They signaled to the market that they were for sale, but only to a white knight who would value their heritage. Far across the Indian Ocean, in Cape Town, Ian Moyer of Woolworths Holdings was watching closely. To understand why a company from the bottom of Africa decided to spend billions on a department store in Sydney, we have to first look at the economic hallucination that was 2014. This was at the tail end of the mining boom, a period when the Australian dollar defied gravity and traded near parity with the US dollar. The world looked at Australia and saw a miracle economy where recession was a myth and disposable income seemed endless. Enter Woolworths Holdings Limited. This isn't the Australian supermarket chain where you buy your milk and bread, but a completely unrelated retail titan based in Cape Town. In South Africa, they dominate the market by selling upscale food and fashion to the upper class. Their CEO at the time was Ian Moyer, a charming Scotsman who had already tasted success in Australia. He had previously run the Country Road Group, which Woolworths Holdings already owned, and turned it into a profit machine. Moyer looked at the Australian department store sector and saw laziness. He saw a duopoly of Myer and David Jones that had grown complacent. His thesis was that Australian retailers were bad at selling clothes, and his scientific South African model was the cure. In their investor presentations, Woolworths Holdings laid out a vision to create a leading Southern Hemisphere retailer. By combining David Jones with their existing Country Road business, they believed they could unlock increased profits by merging back-end systems and reducing headcount. They estimated they could squeeze at least $130 million a year in extra profit just by running things better. However, this vision relied heavily on spreadsheets rather than the reality of the store floor. It assumed that a woman in Vaucluse shopped the same way as a woman in Cape Town, and that efficiency was synonymous with desirability. The first major casualty of the new regime was the merchandise itself. For decades, David Jones operated as a house of brands. You walked in to buy Armani, Zimmermann, and Carla Zampati. David Jones was the curator and the brands were the stars. Ian Moyer and his team wanted to flip this model based on margin calculations. You see, when you sell a pair of Armani jeans, Armani keeps most of the profits. But when you sell a pair of jeans you made yourself, you keep all the profit. They launched a strategy to flood the David Jones floor space with brands they already owned. Woolworths Holdings controlled the Country Road Group, which includes Witchery, Trenery, and Mimco, and they introduced their own South African private labels like Studio W, RE, and JT1. Their strategy documents explicitly stated a goal to increase the sales of these higher margin private label products from a tiny 3% to a massive 20%. To make room for racks of Studio W officewear and Trenery chinos, they had to remove the independent brands that made David Jones special. The discovery element of the department store was replaced by walls of generic mid-market clothing available at any suburban shopping centre. Customers noticed immediately. The grand dame of retail suddenly felt like a glorified country road outlet. The exclusivity had evaporated. By forcing their own supply chain onto the sales floor, they broke the unspoken contract with the Australian shopper. The matriarchs from the North Shore didn't want Studio W. They wanted the brands they knew, and when they couldn't find them at David Jones anymore, they started looking elsewhere. For 178 years, David Jones was a Sydney company. Its heart, soul, and brain were located in the Elizabeth Street flagship. The buyers, planners, and marketers lived in Sydney and understood the nuances of the market, distinguishing between the eastern suburbs socialite and the western suburbs family. Woolworths Holdings, however, based their Australian operations for Country Road in Melbourne. In a quest for efficiency and a single corporate culture, they decided to move the David Jones headquarters from Sydney to Melbourne in around 2017. This move proved catastrophic as the vast majority of the Sydney-based buying team refused to move. These were the people who held personal relationships with designers and knew which shade of blue sold best in Bondi. David Jones replaced them with a new team in Melbourne, largely drafted from the Country Road Group and the mass market world. These were competent vertical retailers used to designing products and pushing them into stores, not curators used to romancing high-end fashion houses. The result was a company that lost its instinct. Buying decisions became disconnected from the core customer, and the Sydney style that defined the brand was diluted by a Melbourne corporate aesthetic. By 2018, finances were in the red, the private label strategy was missing its targets, and the synergies were swallowed by the cost of chaos. The accountants looked at the books and the $2.1 billion purchase price and realized the asset on the balance sheet was a ghost. It was time to admit they had made a terrible mistake. In January 2018, 4 years after buying David Jones, Woolworths Holdings announced a non-cash impairment charge of $712.5 million. In plain English, they admitted the company they bought for $2.1 billion was now worth more than $1 billion less. They had overpaid and they knew it. In 2019, they slashed the value by another $437 million. The asset was absolutely melting. Billions evaporated, driven by tough trading conditions and the structural shift to online shopping. To stop the bleeding, they started selling whatever they could. For over a century, David Jones had been one of the biggest landlords in the country. Owning their buildings was their safety net. When retail was bad, the property value kept the balance sheet healthy. Woolworths needed cash, so they liquidated the real estate. They sold the iconic Market Street building in Sydney for roughly $360 million, and they sold the building on Burke Street, Melbourne, for $121 million. This turned David Jones from a landlord into a tenant, suddenly needing to pay rent to stay in their own homes, locking them into a death spiral of higher operating costs and lower revenue. The leadership office became a revolving door. CEOs came and went with dizzying speed. Paul Zara left in 2014. Ian Nairn lasted 14 months. John Dixon took over and then left. David Thomas stepped in, followed by Scott Fife. Each new CEO arrived with a transformation plan, promising to fix the basics and digitalize the business. But the business was already fundamentally flawed, and their efforts were unlikely to succeed. By 2022, Woolworths Holdings had had enough. The Australian adventure had become a nightmare, dragging down their South African share price. They wanted out. In December 2022, the news broke. Woolworths Holdings was selling David Jones, and they were able to find a buyer in Anchorage Capital Partners. Anchorage is a private equity firm known as a turnaround specialist. They buy distressed assets, fix them up, strip out costs, and flip them for a profit. The most shocking part was the price. While the exact figure wasn't disclosed in the initial press release, financial reporters and insiders pegged the deal value at approximately $100 million. Think about that for a second. In 2014, David Jones was bought for $2.1 billion. In 2023, it was sold for $100 million. That's a value destruction of 95%. It stands as one of the worst corporate deals in Australian history. Under Anchorage, the reality of the situation has become stark. They made efforts to, quote, optimize the network, which is just corporate code for downsizing. The store at Eastland has already shut its doors, while the Tuggerah and Castle Towers locations are expected to shut as well. The footprint is shrinking in real time. What was once a national department store is rapidly dissolving into a series of disconnected outposts. So, what's David Jones today? Well, it's a company trapped in a time warp. Walk into the Elizabeth Street flagship, and you can still see the bones of the old world. The high ceilings remain, the view of Hyde Park remains, but the soul is gone. That feeling is dead. Woolworths Holdings took a piece of Australian history and treated it like a spreadsheet entry. They ignored the nuance, the history, and the customer. Now, David Jones exists in a state of zombie retail. It's too big to close completely, but too broken to matter. It's a museum of things we used to buy, in a way we used to shop, owned by people who are just trying to get their money back. The next time you walk past a David Jones, take a good look. You aren't just looking at a shop, you're looking at a $2 billion monument to corporate arrogance. But what do you think? Is there any way back for David Jones, or is the department store model officially dead? Do you miss the old David Jones, or do you shop online like everyone else? Let me know your memories in the comments section below, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into the collapse of an Aussie icon, make sure to like and subscribe for more business autopsies. Thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, stay curious.